Sugar is fat. How high cholesterol, blood fats altogether actually happens. Now, when I say sugar is fat, I'm not saying that sugar is identical in chemical structure as fat. What I'm saying is under certain circumstances, the body will treat sugar and excess sugar as if it actually is fat. And as far as high cholesterol and high blood fats goes, sugar is actually the culprit. I know it sounds crazy, but let's go over it together. At some point, we've all heard the term eating more fat makes you fat. Well, the reason why we believe this is because, well, if we are becoming fat ourselves, and if we have high amounts of blood fats in our body, well then doesn't it make sense that we should decrease our dietary fat? Shouldn't we stop eating fat in order for us to stop becoming fat? This couldn't be further from the truth. It's almost the same to say, eating more blueberries will make you a blueberry. You're not going to become the very thing that you're eating, and that's kind of what we're saying here. We're saying that if we continue to eat high amounts of fats, we're going to become fat. No, okay? It's almost like we're saying eating more beef will cause you to moo. You're not going to become a cow if you eat beef. You're not going to become the very thing that you're eating. There's much more happening on the inside of the body. It's not as simple as eating what it is and then becoming what it is. It's just not that simple. Doesn't eating a lot of fat cause heart disease, atherosclerosis, arteriosclerosis, heart attacks, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, colon cancer, high triglycerides, anxiety, depression, diabetes, obesity, insulin resistance, leptin resistance, anxiety, weight gain, cellulite? The answer is no. This is false. Just because the end state of these disease states are basically high amounts of blood fats, high amounts of fat altogether in the body, just because those are the end states doesn't mean that we could just correlate that with dietary fat, just because they're the same word, just because they sound the same. That's a little naive. That's overlooking a lot of things. And so a good example of this is, of course, what we've been talking about. Having high amounts of dietary fat are going to make you fat. So let's look at that for a moment. Now, we've all looked at that sentence before, correlation does not imply causation. And what does this really mean? This means that if we have a variable, let's just say variable A, okay? And every time that variable A comes up, variable B shortly follows, or at some point in the future follows. But basically every time, or the majority of the time, variable A pops up, variable B will follow. Now, to assume that variable A causes variable B because of this relationship is naive, and it's also a little bit lazy. We're not doing our homework. We need to look at the entire environment. Are there other things that cause variable B to pop up? Because it might not just be variable A. There might be other variables together that cause variable B. So let's talk about that. So let's look at an example from the standpoint of a high-fat intake. So we have our high-fat intake here, and what we know in our society is that it causes these disease states. Now, if we're solely focusing on having a high-fat intake, and then at the end of the day, we're looking at all of these people in our society who have heart disease, have heart attacks, arteriosclerosis, so on and so forth, and we really dissect their bodies and we look into what's happening and we're seeing the pile up, the blockages that are caused by fat, we're seeing a correlation. Now that's the thing, it's a correlation. It's involved. It's not the cause, but it's involved. Okay? But now, when we throw into the mix a high carbohydrate intake, okay, we find the same exact thing. We find these disease states being caused as well. So for many years, we've been neglecting the fact that maybe along with a high fat intake, okay, there has also been a high dietary carbohydrate intake present. Okay? It's very easy for us to blame dietary fat when we're finding fat in the arteries, but there's something very complicated going on inside the body that is causing the blockages of fat. Now, if you remember from the previous sections, what does high amounts of carbohydrates, high amounts of refined carbohydrates bring to the body? Okay, well, it signals the pancreas to secrete insulin. And insulin is the fat storage hormone. Okay, so the more insulin that we have in our body, the more fat we're going to store. So let's just say we're having high amounts of carbohydrates and we have now insulin being secreted into the body. We're getting ready to store, and then along for the ride also go high amounts of fat. We're going to have even more fat stored. And then we have something called liver lipogenesis. Now, what ends up happening is, as you're taking in macronutrients and your liver starts to see that there's an excess amount of carbohydrates. Glycogen stores are full in the liver, and so now there's an excess. What does it do with it? Well, it takes that sugar and it changes it to fat, and it stores it in the liver, surrounding the liver. This is visceral fat. This is the bad fat that we don't want. Okay, so a buildup of this visceral fat, and as visceral fat starts to expand, okay, the higher amount of blood fats you're going to have. And we're going to go through it together right now. So let's just look here. We have the liver, okay? Now, as you can see, this is a healthy liver. There is no cirrhosis, meaning there's no fattiness around it. But as visceral fat increases, all right, as you can see here, this is the visceral fat. As this increases, it's going to cause a backup in the blood. What ends up happening is the liver takes some of this fat surrounding itself, okay? It changes it into triglycerides, and then it pushes it into the blood. Okay, so this is when blood fats actually rise. Now remember, the reason why the visceral fat even came into place was because of excess carbohydrates in the diet. Insulin was secreted too much. Because there's too much carbohydrates in the diet, the liver responds by taking those carbohydrates, changing it to fat, and storing it surrounding it and the organs, okay? Pushes it into the bloodstream. This is where we start to see those high amounts of blood fats, cholesterol, triglycerides, and then the end result is going to be pushing those blood fats, okay, the excess amount of fat in the blood to your subcutaneous fat, which is the fat surrounding your body. And this is what your liver does in order to save itself. If the liver didn't do this, if it didn't push some of that visceral fat into the blood and then into your subcutaneous fat, you would die. This is a defense mechanism. Our subcutaneous fat can basically grow as much as we want or as much as the body will allow us to without dying. So let's go over it one more time. The visceral fat here that's surrounding the liver, it was brought by the excess amount of carbohydrates in your diet. The liver needs to protect itself, so it takes that visceral fat, changes it to triglycerides, and pushes it into the blood to transport it to your subcutaneous fat. And as it transports it, it goes through the blood. And so that's where we find those high amounts of blood fats. Okay, so step one, excess carbohydrates / energy accumulation. We're consuming excess amount of carbohydrates. As glycogen stores rise, okay, that's stored carbohydrate. Once we top off our storages for carbohydrates, we're gonna have to do something with the excess. And as you've all heard, we store it as fat, and this is what happens. The liver then takes some of those carbohydrates, those excess carbohydrates, changes it to fat, and some of it gets deposited into that visceral fat area. Liver storage and visceral fat increases, as we've said before, it stores it around itself. Step 3, liver becomes insulin resistant. So again, as we talked about insulin resistance in the past sections, okay? You're going to need more insulin in order for it to be effective. But let's just say you are becoming insulin resistant. The fact that you need more of it means you're going to store even more and more fat. And if this happens with the liver, that means you're going to be storing even more fat surrounding the liver, and that means that even more fat is going to be pushed into the blood. Number 4, pancreas releases more insulin to make liver do its job. So as we've said before, the liver is not doing its job very efficiently. It's slowing up the process because of that visceral fat. And so the body realizes, the hypothalamus realizes this, the pancreas realizes this. So the pancreas says, okay, clearly you need more insulin because it's not effective. So it pushes it into the system. The liver stores even more visceral fat. More insulin released causes further body fat storage. So as we discussed before, as it goes along, the pancreas is going to release more insulin. Insulin is the fat storage hormone. The more insulin, the more fat. And as it continues to do this, you're just going to deposit even more subcutaneous fat, meaning you're going to basically be depositing more body fat. Number 6, liver tries to export excess fat as triglycerides. So when you go to the doctor and the doctor's telling you, okay, look, you need to decrease your dietary fat because your cholesterol is way too high. No, okay? The liver is only trying to do its job. The liver is seeing that there's excess amount of carbohydrates in the diet. It's saying, I need to take some of this, change it to fat. I'm going to store it around me. When the storage gets too high, it pushes it through the bloodstream. And this is where we find that excess amount of triglycerides. This is why your triglycerides are high. Number 7, blood lipids rise. And so we can find ourselves in this perpetual state of consuming high amounts of carbohydrates, the visceral fat is being stored, liver's trying to save itself, and it has to push it into the blood so it can transport it to our subcutaneous fat. If you continue to have high amounts of carbohydrates, this is the perpetual state. This is why blood values will constantly be high. So let's go through a couple of examples that you might find yourself go through. So Mike learned from his doctor that he has high cholesterol. A response might be a low-fat/low cholesterol diet. Now the problem, just like we've discussed before, how this happens, okay, is going to be dietary carbohydrate and back up in the liver. But if you're just simply decreasing your cholesterol intake, decreasing your fat intake, and you're continuing a carbohydrate-rich diet, cholesterol is not going to change, just as we discussed. Letter B, Sarah has gained 30 pounds of subcutaneous and visceral fat. Response number 1, a low-fat/low calorie diet. So let's just combine the two. Even if we combine the two, we're not addressing the real problem. There's backup in the liver because of excess carbohydrate consumption, because the liver's trying to get rid of excess sugar. And so this doesn't address that. Even if it's a low-calorie diet, which there have been plenty of studies out there showing that having a low-calorie diet is going to show blood fats go down. But here's the thing, there's inconsistencies. A low-calorie diet is very general. So if you have studies out there that are doing different types of low-calorie diets that are different macronutrient ratios, you're gonna find one of them work. And if one of them works, our society tends to push whatever works as if it 100% works. This is a very big problem that we have. And response number 2, a low-carb diet. Okay, so this might work, all right? A low-carbohydrate diet might work. But if we're doing a low-carb diet by itself, where we're not changing anything else and we're not actually replacing the carbohydrates with anything, eventual relapse might happen, okay? So we need the body to understand that fat is the primary fuel source. This is what ketosis is. So when we go on a low-carbohydrate diet, ketosis is not just low carbs and that's it. There's lots of other things that need to happen here. So in order for us to correct subcutaneous and visceral fat, lose weight, it's not just about low carbohydrates. So in some cases, it could work. In most cases, we're going to see relapse. Letter C, Bill has high fasted blood sugar and increased bloating in the midsection. Response 1, eat healthier. This is everybody's response. We all think that we know what healthy is. If it's a fruit or a vegetable or a grain that's not refined, we're eating healthy. Today, vegan is tagged as being healthy, which if you're eating like a pure vegan, okay, we're not talking about foods that are stamped as vegan on the outside of boxes, then okay, that's a different story. But the problem is that we all have a different definition of what healthy is. And so if we're just gonna eat healthier by the standards of thousands, millions, then it's just not something that's concrete. Response 2, a low-calorie diet. Now again, like I've said, there's been plenty of studies that show that a low-calorie diet, semi-fasting states, okay, are going to lower blood values, but these are not sustainable because they're not addressing the real problem, okay? The real problem with blood fats is going to be carbohydrate, and not only that, when we lower dietary carbohydrate, we have to make sure that we're replacing it with something, okay? There needs to be a response. So let's go through a couple of values, common responses, and outcomes. So we've got high total cholesterol. Common response would be eat less cholesterol. Outcome would be no effing idea. The next value would be high blood sugar. Common response, eat less carbs/sugar. Outcome, eventual relapse. Now again, this is not me being pessimistic. This is just science, and this is basically what most case studies go on. If you're just decreasing dietary carbohydrate, we're going to run into a problem. Sure, there are plenty of people out there. The numbers in mass numbers are actually very small, but there are people out there who can decrease dietary carbohydrate and they can fight their hormones and their neurotransmitters and they'll be miserable and they can do it. It's been done before, but it's not the best way to go. And from a mass numbers standpoint, it's not sustainable. Value, high body fat. Common response, eat less overall calories. Outcome, we just don't know. Again, high body fat, we need to address insulin and carbohydrates. Calories is too general. We need to be more specific. High triglycerides. Common response, eat less dietary fat. Outcome, triglycerides remain high. Almost all the time, if you decrease dietary fat expecting for your blood lipids to go down, even if it's triglycerides, cholesterol, VLDL, LDL, it's not going to happen because we're not addressing the real problem, which is the liver and excess carbohydrate. I thought this was really interesting and I really wanted to throw it into this section. So this quote was said by Governor Tom Vilsack, U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, upon release of the 2010 dietary guidelines. So this was 8 years ago. This is somebody that is in the mix as far as the dietary guidelines being constructed. And this is what he had to say. If folks want to maintain a healthy weight, they have to be sensitive to calories in and calories out. Not every calorie is the same. Huh? What? So let's break this down together. If folks want to maintain a healthy weight, they have to be sensitive to calories in and calories out. So let's break this down. If you want to maintain your weight, then what you eat is what you must burn, okay? If you eat 175 calories, you must burn 175 calories and then you will maintain your weight. No, okay? And not every calorie is the same. So you're saying that we can treat every calorie as if they're the same, and then the very next sentence you're saying that not every calorie is the same. What? There can be plenty of scenarios where 175 calories are broken down into different macronutrient breakdowns. We can have 175 calories with 14 grams of fat, 6 grams of protein, and 6 grams of carbohydrates. And then we can have 175 calories in a different macronutrient breakdown of 2 grams of fat, 9 grams of protein, and 30 grams of carbohydrates. And just based upon what we've talked about all along, this 30 grams of carbohydrates as it pertains to insulin and body fat storage is a massive problem. But in the other 175 calories, we have carbohydrates at 6 and fat at 14. And this ratio is much better as far as ketosis goes. So what is he talking about? Let's go through all of the macronutrients and what they signify. So we've got fat at 9 calories per gram, okay? And this is gonna be our primary fuel source for ketosis, okay? And we've already learned that high amounts of fat in the diet, as long as carbohydrates are low, is safe and is optimal for ketosis. Alcohol, ethyl alcohol in particular, 7 calories per gram. This is drinking alcohol. Protein, 4 calories per gram. Not a fuel source, okay? This is to rebuild body tissue. Carbohydrates, 4 calories per gram, okay? Not only that, they have a hormonal response of insulin and they are correlated with storing fat. Sugar alcohols, 1.5 to 3 calories per gram. These are sugars that are signified as the sweeteners, okay? They're gonna be the low-calorie sweeteners that we don't know yet today what kind of response they have with insulin. We do think that they have little correlations with excreting some insulin, but the studies aren't there just yet. And fiber, 1.5 calories per gram. Not only is fiber going to be low in calorie and it's also considered a carbohydrate, it's extremely important for the motility and moving nutrients throughout the entire digestive tract. Not only that, it's going to help slow absorption. Fiber is going to be one of the most important macronutrients in ketosis and in health. Not every calorie is the same. He's right, not every calorie is the same, as you can see. But the previous sentence signifies that maybe he doesn't really understand what's going on here. which is a problem because these are some of the people that actually tell us what's right and what's wrong, what we should eat, what we shouldn't eat, and how much of what we should eat and how much of what we shouldn't eat. So it's a problem. The powers that be, the people that are kind of at the forefront of constructing these programs for us to kind of follow, it just seems like they don't really understand it themselves. So what do we take away from this section? Okay, number one, we've got visceral fat, which is the fat we don't want. That's the fat surrounding the organs. The reason why we have high blood fats, high cholesterol, LDL, VLDL, triglycerides, the reason why we have these is because the liver is trying to save itself. It's taking that visceral fat, changing it to triglycerides and pushing it through the blood so it can bring it to the subcutaneous fat surrounding the body. This is how high blood fats happens. It's dietary carbohydrate, not dietary fat. Number two, macronutrients are different in calorie. Not only that, they have different hormonal responses and different jobs. So to treat calories as if they're all the same is just not true. You can have different macronutrient breakdowns and they can add up to the same amount of calories. So they mean two very different things. Macronutrients all have very specific jobs and different jobs. These are the two things I want you to take away from this section. Write them down. Super excited. We're on our way to putting our body into ketosis the right way. See you guys in the next section. What's up, everybody? Welcome back. We have learned so much information. We've learned about leptin, insulin, dopamine. We have learned that carbohydrates, refined carbohydrates, carbohydrates in high amounts are the real reason why high blood fats, high cholesterol actually happens, gets backed up in the visceral fat surrounding the organs. This is not good. Essentially, at first hand, it looks like fat is the problem, but it is not. So we have learned that the metabolism is very, very much controlled by your hormones and neurotransmitters in the brain. Now our nerves can be calmed essentially. That fat is not the culprit. We can be eating higher amounts of fat so long as carbohydrate percentage goes down. We're going to talk more specifically about percentages and macronutrients in the following sections. This next section, we're going to be talking about what ketosis actually is. I am super pumped for you guys. We are on our way to our goals and our new life. See you there.